return to the issue of Ukraine. And I'm joined now by former strategic communications advisor to Plavko Klimkin, when he was Ukraine's foreign affairs minister, Cormac Smith, to discuss the situation in Ukraine. And of course, the breaking news is Russia banning a list of ministers, including Boris Johnson and others. What's the significance of that, do we think? Does it matter at all, Cormac, that Russia has sought to make that statement following the UK, Europe and others, also, of course, putting members of the Duma on the sanctions list?
David, good afternoon or good evening, and thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you.
Look, at the risk of sounding trite, I'm inclined to say that I take this as a badge of honour. I've been doing interviews on Ukraine since about January this year, and I've been telling anybody who would listen that Britain, and I'm an Irishman, but an Irishman has lived here for 35 years and served as a civil servant and diplomat. Britain has been, if not Ukraine's best friend on the face of the earth, certainly among Ukraine's best friends. And that has only been underlined in everything we have done. And yes, I think the Prime Minister's trip to Kyiv last week was hugely significant, but it goes way beyond that. So the fact that the Kremlin has decided to ban Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and the Defence Secretary and a range of other civil servants and people, on the one hand is laughable, but on the other hand, I think it's actually recognition. You know, the Ukrainians recognize us as their best or among their best friends. And now the Russians recognize us as among Ukraine's best friends. I don't think the Prime Minister or the Foreign Secretary or others will be losing an awful lot of sleep about the fact that they can't visit Russia any day soon.
Yes, absolutely. As I would. Let's see if they decide to add the opposition, which I suspect would include me, to the list in the coming days. And I certainly won't be losing any sleep. The other thing, of course, that's happened this week is the sinking of the Russian flagship warship, Moskva, the fire that took place on that ship and various allegations about whether it was sunk by the Ukrainians or whether something else happened on that ship. But it feeds into this broader issue of the equipment and the arms and the supplies that the Ukrainians have been asking for from the West. They got more commitments from the UK this week. We've seen this continued bombing of Mariupol. We've seen more strikes on Kiev. We're now getting into a very tough period as we move towards the 8th week of this conflict. What are your reflections on the sinking of that ship and where the Ukrainians are in relation to the military equipment and support that they need?
Okay, David, a number of questions there. First, I think the sinking of the Moskva is hugely significant. It's actually, I'd like to remind listeners, it's the largest battleship sunk since the Second World War. And then I went to check the Belgrano. It's actually larger than the Belgrano was. So this is a huge moral boost for the Ukrainians, but also it's very, very significant in that it is taking a key piece of kit out of Russia's armory that they were clearly using to bombard cities and for air defense and so forth. So it's a huge moral blow for the Ukrainians. And also, to tie into your second question about the weapons that we're giving, you will have seen that some of the weapons that we have now committed are these Harpoon anti-ship missiles. This apparently, I'm not sure if they're in place yet, but the Ukrainians are claiming that this was struck by two of their manufacturer, Neptune harpoons. Now, look, I'm the Irish-British diplomat who sees the world through Ukrainian eyes. I am absolutely on Ukraine's side. I worked at the heart of the Ukrainian government for 2 years. So I see Ukraine as fundamentally different when it comes to the truth, right? So I have very, very little hesitation in believing the daily reports from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. And indeed, I absolutely believe that this ship was sunk Ukrainian missiles. And I think the proof of that is, while on the one hand Russia is denying it and saying it's a fire on board, on the other hand they're already saying that in retaliation for it they're going to be escalating strikes on Kyiv, which have started going on already. So, I mean, from my point of view, I would put it to you and listeners that there is, given the fact that Russia lies on an industrial scale, I think there's very, very little doubt that this was sunk by the Ukrainians, and with an older weapon. So I think it says more for the Ukrainians' battle sense and their tactical ability and nous than anything else. But it's of huge, huge significance. It's been compared to the sinking of the Bismarck in the Second World War.
And one last issue, the other thing we've seen this week is Finland and Sweden accelerating their decision to join NATO. We've also seen, as a consequence of that, threats from Russia. Many people said that what Vladimir Putin was doing in Ukraine would actually consolidate opinion across Europe. NATO would grow in strength and in unity, and I think that's what we're seeing. And it's a major decision for Finland. They have a 830-mile border with Russia, alongside Sweden. These are countries that have traditionally tried to be neutral and non-aligned in their approach to foreign policy. A major decision to join the North Atlantic Treaty. What's your view on where we're heading in terms of that solidity of opinion that stands against, if you like, Russia and will act together in the face of aggression?
Look, I think it shows how strategically inept Russia is. And this is something that colleagues from different countries, diplomats who had a lot more of experience than me, when I was out there between 2016 and 18, were constantly telling me that the Russians weren't that smart, that they were opportunistic. I think this shows they started with demands that NATO return its borders to 1997. What they have got in return is they have got possibly a NATO that is more united, although I think it has a way to go, but a NATO that is more united against them than any time in its history. One, they have a Finland. I listened interestingly to the former Prime Minister of Finland, interviewed, I think, by Nick Ferrari during the week, and he said, "Look, we're not afraid of Russia, and we will join NATO, and we will make NATO stronger. And I would just remind you, we can mobilize 300,000 troops overnight and have a further 900,000 reserves to call on." Now, we know the Finns don't do disinformation. The Russians do. And we know what happened in 1938 when Russia invaded Finland. They got their backside handed to them on a plate. So I think, you know, of what Putin has achieved is the exact opposite of what he was demanding before Christmas. And yeah, he seems to be threatening everybody at the moment. He seems to be nuclear saber rattling. Which is, you know, I don't really want to comment on that because I'm not a military expert, but it's clearly something that we have to deal with. The one thing I would say is we cannot deal with it by being cowed by it and saying, oh my God, we can't escalate any further, or we can't, you know, basically do all the things that Putin is telling us not to do because he's threatening us with nuclear war. It's a particular challenge, but I see every step recently as being a bad misstep for Putin.
Cormac Smith, former strategic communications advisor to the Ukraine's Foreign Affairs Minister. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us that update. Sean in Islington, we're back to